I do want to thank you. It is an honor. It's an honor to be asked by AIPAC and by your synagogue. The rabbi mentioned that we're celebrating the 73rd birthday of Israel. That is a remarkable event, no matter how you slice it. When you think about everything that Israel has been through since 1948, if not before, with the Yishuv and the struggles that it went through to get there. Today, we look at an Israel that is incredibly strong. There is no other way to describe it. This is a country that is now more than 80% vaccinated among adults over 16. That is a remarkable number, especially when you think about where the rest of the world is right now. And Israelis had every reason to celebrate. On Sunday, the mandate for Israelis to walk around wearing masks will be lifted. They'll still have to wear them indoors, but outdoors that will no longer be necessary. And I think Israelis at this point can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we can only hope that as a country here, that we will be in the same place soon. But the Israelis, I think, if they showed remarkable initiative, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went out of his way to be a nudnik with the pharmaceutical companies, making sure that he had enough. The Mossad got involved. It was really, he pulled out all of the stops, and at the end of the day, Israel is much stronger for it. Now, as the Israelis were celebrating their 73rd Yom HaAtzmaut, they were setting off firecrackers, and then more firecrackers started to come. And these were not lit by the Israelis. These were lit by Hamas. And we began to see rockets coming in to Israel. In fact, for two nights in a row now, we have seen Hamas rockets being fired into the southern areas of Israel. Now, the amazing thing about this is that it didn't stop any of the barbecues. It didn't really stop any of the celebrations. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that Israel has developed remarkable technology, otherwise known as Iron Dome. Iron Dome is the missile defense system that was developed with US assistance that helps Israel knock rockets down out of the sky. It is really like a bullet hitting a bullet, both in terms of speed and in terms of accuracy. And so the Israelis have remained safe from this for a very long time. Few of the rockets fired from the Gaza Strip have actually landed and done damage to Israel. The system actually is able to determine if rockets are going to miss their mark, and if they explode in the desert, well, then the Israelis actually let them go and don't even try to intercept them. This is how smart the system is. Now, what's interesting is that in the last couple of years, Israel has identified a new threat coming out of the Gaza Strip, and that is that Hamas has been building tunnels. These are tunnels that have been dug across the border from Gaza into Israel with the intention on the part of Hamas to carry out commando attacks, to carry out attacks against Israel with terrorists brandishing grenades and AK-47s and the like. And this, of course, has created a lot of anxiety in Israel. And so since 2014, the last major war, the Israelis have been hard at work. Last week, they issued a remarkable announcement, which I think is really worth highlighting here. And that is that they have a new fence around the Gaza Strip. The fence has been there since 2005 or so, during the Second Intifada, if everybody remembers that campaign of violence. But the fence was not able to do anything to stop the tunnels. And that's in fact why Hamas started carrying out these activities. What we've just learned from the Israelis is that they have done we've never seen this before. They've built an underground tunnel, or underground tunnel preventer rather, a fence that goes tens of meters, let's just say 50 or 100 yards, let's just say almost a football field beneath the ground. And it has sensors that enables Israel to know when someone is digging near their fence. And then in some cases, the Israelis are able to send underground vehicles through their own tunneling systems to neutralize the people who are trying to attack Israel. Not only that, but the Israelis have built the same underground fence in the Mediterranean Sea, so that if there are people who are trying to swim underwater into Israel, they will be stopped by the fence as well. And on top of that, there is the above ground component of this, which has sensors that enables Israel to identify earlier when rockets are being fired, and then they're able to shoot off Iron Dome and intercept them. In the southern part of Israel, the country is as safe as it has ever been, And it has everything to do with the remarkable technology that the startup nation continues to develop. And these are the kinds of systems, by the way, that I hope that the United States will consider acquiring as well. We will be needing them on our southern border, on our northern border, but also around our bases around the world. And this is the kind of thing that will only reinforce the wonderful alliance that we already have that exists today between Israel and the United States. And it's an alliance, of course, that all of us are committed to ensuring. Now, this is one of the good news stories coming out of Israel. I have, of course, I never give a speech without providing some bad news as well. And of course, it's always the case with Israel that there is good and bad. This is the story of Israel after all. And with that, I'll move to Israel's northern border. There is a lot of instability. The country of Lebanon is really about to collapse. The country does not have a functioning government and has not for quite a long time. But more importantly, their economy is in a tailspin. They have inflation that is really skyrocketing. The cost of a meal in a restaurant right now in Lebanon is roughly the same as the average person's monthly rent, just to give a sense of how bad things are going over there. And as a result, the army is not able to pay its salaries. The government, the police are not able to pay their salaries. So what's happened is that there is an actor that has stepped in to fill the void. And that actor is, of course, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an Iran-backed terrorist organization that has been committed to the destruction of Israel since the early 1980s. And Israel has, of course, been involved in a number of skirmishes with Hezbollah over the years. And the Israelis ultimately left the country in the year 2000 after having a presence there trying to curb a lot of the terrorist activity. And this is actually where I think the real challenge began for Israel, because what happened is that Iran began to smuggle a huge amount of weaponry to Hezbollah, to its proxy in Lebanon. And for a while, Israel wasn't very worried because they were able to knock down those same rockets with that same Iron Dome technology, keeping Israelis safe in the north as well as the south. What we're learning about now, and I will tell you now, you will be reading about this more and more. You'll be seeing it in the Jerusalem Post or Times of Israel or whatever your news sources are. There is a new weapon that Iran is smuggling into Lebanon, and they are called PGMs, precision guided munitions. What these rockets do that the other rockets don't is they are able to be guided. So in other words, anytime Israel wants to try to fire an Iron Dome interceptor to destroy a rocket that's flying into Israel, they can turn left, right, up, down. They can evade the systems that Israel has. But more importantly, they have the ability to be extremely precise in what they hit. They can hit within about 10 yards of their intended target. Now, that's amazing because really we've never seen terrorist groups acquire this kind of technology. Previously, it was only something that countries like the United States developed in the late 1990s. But here we are 20 years or so later, and we're beginning to see that terrorist groups have caught on. And the danger that Israelis are warning about right now is that if enough of these rockets are fired and enough of them overwhelm Israel's defense systems, well, then they could hit a chemical plant in Haifa. They could hit the Kiryat, which is sort of the Pentagon of Israel in Tel Aviv. They could hit the Dimona reactor in southern Israel, which of course is believed to house some of Israel's nuclear technology. So in other words, the concern right now out of Israel is that that Hezbollah, with the help of Iran, could be able to prompt the next major war by carrying out an attack with some of these very, very precise munitions. Now, the good news, of course, is that Israel continues to carry out strikes all over the Middle East, neutralizing this technology. What the Israelis call it is they call it the war between wars, where they are constantly hunting for these weapons and destroying them. You've probably seen articles in the news sources that you read where an explosion happens in the middle of the night in Syria. An explosion takes place at the airport in Damascus. An explosion takes place on the border between Iraq and Syria. And usually nobody claims credit for this. I will tell you now, it's Israel. It's the Israeli Air Force. They are going around looking for this technology and trying to destroy it before it reaches the wrong hands. And so Israel has really been able to limit how successful Hezbollah has been in bringing this weaponry in. The problem, of course, is that there are always going to be some that get into the country. And right now, the Israelis tell me that there are probably a few hundred that Hezbollah has in their possession, and a few hundred could still be enough to carry out an attack that could prompt the next conflict. Now, Israel could try to knock these out, but of course, we know where Hezbollah hides its rockets. They hide them under schools and hospitals and apartment buildings. And so when Israel does prepare to attack, we as American Jews that support Israel will need to remind our friends and our neighbors and the media and anyone who will listen, not least our members of Congress, that there are human shields that are being deployed in Lebanon, and that it will not be Israel's fault when it comes time for Israel to defend itself. It will not be its fault if there are casualties. Hezbollah created a system where there would be casualties. That was their design. And of course, it's not only Hezbollah's design. The design comes from its patron. And I want to turn to that for a moment because Iran has been in the news quite a bit in recent weeks. The United States is about to probably make a very big mistake in that the United States is preparing to head back into the 2015 nuclear deal, otherwise known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. Now, I will tell you that as an analyst here in Washington, working for a think tank, I am not opposed to a deal with Iran as long as it is a deal that prevents Iran from going nuclear, period. And as long as it prevents Iran from sponsoring terrorism, period. What we're hearing now and what we saw before in 2015 is that the United States is willing to spend money to give sanctions relief to Iran in exchange for Iran making a temporary nuclear deal. And so from Israel's perspective, from my perspective, from many Americans' perspective, this is highly problematic because it means that in another 5 or 10 years, Iran will go nuclear. And in the meantime, it will be receiving billions of dollars in cash from the United States and others in sanctions relief. And they will be spending that money on Hamas, on Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups around the world. And so you see right now a very nervous Israel, and you see a very nervous Jewish community here in the United States where we're trying to warn that this is a mistake. We don't know whether it's something that will be able to be stopped, but what I can tell you is that Israel is not sitting on its hands. Israel never does. We learned this week that Israel carried out a cyber attack inside the Natanz nuclear facility. This is a place where they enrich uranium. Israel was able to knock out the electrical system through a cyber virus. Unbelievable technology. Again, the startup nation is at work, and they were able to set back the work that was being done at this facility by 9 months. And in the meantime, the Israelis have been carrying out a very careful a strategy of attacking Iranian military ships all throughout the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean. And so there is a quiet campaign that is going on. There are countries in Europe, there's even people here in the United States government who don't like Israel taking the offensive. But what we can say for sure, whenever you talk to an Israeli official, they will tell you that they learned one thing over their years of sorrow and hardship, and that is that Israel does not rely on anyone else for its security. And so it is for this reason that Israel is taking matters into its own hands and trying to actually give the United States leverage as it continues to negotiate with the Iranians. The hope is that the Iranians look weaker and feel more pressure to make concessions at the negotiating table. And it's for that reason I believe that Israel is doing the right thing. But there are still tensions, and we still continue to see Israel sending messages to the United States warning, don't go back into a deal that gives Iran too much. Let's make sure that we do it right this time. Prevent nuclear developments completely. Prevent terrorism completely. Now, the thing that I will say is that this time Israel has a secret weapon. And this is undoubtedly good news. And it's not technological and it's not military. The Israelis have new allies. As we saw in August and September and October of last year, the Israelis signed 4 peace agreements with Arab states. This is, we talk about 73 years of Israel's existence. 73 years ago, this was unthinkable. My grandparents would be quelling right now just thinking about this as they remember Israel's isolation in the 1940s and 1950s, even into the 1960s. Now we have the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan have all signed normalization agreements with Israel. And what is remarkable about this is that they did it not for concessions. They did it because they recognized that Israel had a voice that they needed, because they too are concerned about the threat from Iran. And so what we're now seeing is a bunch of these Arab countries coming together with Israel and warning the United States alongside Israel. This has never happened in the history of the Jewish state, that Israel has this kind of alliance system. And of course, that's building upon Egypt, it's building upon Jordan, and we think that there could even be other countries that follow soon. One of them could be Saudi Arabia. Just think about it. This is a remarkable moment in the Middle East. And so Israel right now is on the precipice of potentially great things, even as the threat continues to grow. I can only tell you that we don't know where any of these conflicts will go. We don't know where these new alliances will lead. But we can say that Israel has done something that no one thought it would 73 years ago. Israel has not just persevered, but it has thrived. And that has everything to do with their own toughness, their own intuitions, their own desire to make a mark in the world, but it also has quite a bit to do with the American Jewish community, which has stood by its side for more than 7 decades. And it's for that reason alone that I am thrilled to be with you tonight. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I will end it here, and I will leave it to the rabbi to see if there are questions that I can answer. But again, it has been an honor to speak with you this evening.
Yes, so if you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself.
Hey, Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hi.
I sure can.
Thank you for your speech. Just curious, who would you say was a broker that helped this peace accord between Israel and the 4 Arab nations? Was there a broker that is recognized?
Absolutely. I mean, well, first I'll tell you the joke in the Middle East. The joke in the Middle East is that Barack Obama should have received a second Nobel Prize, because when the former president decided to engage in the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, he so thoroughly alarmed the Arab states that they realized that they had no choice but to work with the strongest military, the strongest diplomatic force, and the strongest voice in their region. And they began to work very closely with Israel. So the joke is that that Barack Obama shouldn't have got his Nobel Prize in 2009 for overturning Bush policies, but that he should have got one in 2015, not because he stopped the Iranians from going nuclear, but because he so thoroughly scared the Israelis and Arabs that they realized that they were each other's only real friends. So the joke is that, but we all know exactly what happened, and that is that Jared Kushner and his father-in-law, Donald Trump, spent a huge amount of time taking advantage of what had started in 2015. They saw that there was an opportunity and they pushed for it. Now, I don't want to say that Donald Trump completely understood the dynamics, but I will say that Jared Kushner did. And I think that when the history books are written, I believe that Jared Kushner will go down as probably one of America's most unlikely and remarkable peacemakers. And Donald Trump should get his due as well as the president that presided over it and really pushed at the leadership level. My only regret, quite frankly, is that the Saudis came a little bit late to the party. Right now, they are taking a lot of heat from this administration, in some ways deserved, in some ways not deserved at all. But the Saudis, I believe, if we open up the door to peace with Israel, I think they will walk through it. And once the Saudis do, the rest of the region will have virtually no choice but to follow. This is the leader of soft power in the region, and it will be quite a scene if the Saudis finally do what I think they're going to do in the coming years. I hope that answers your question.
I have a question. Can you help speculate what is the motivation of this administration to move back into the Iran deal? I'm really mystified by it because they're proactively going down a path that I just don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm having a hard time too. It's kind of remarkable when we look back at the Obama years in the 2013 to 2015 negotiation period. The Iranians had lost a huge amount of their cash. They only had about $20 billion left in their reserves, and the Obama administration came in and gave them a lifeline. All of a sudden, gave them about $150 billion, which they were able to spend all over the region, and it resuscitated their regime, which was basically on its deathbed. Now, you fast forward to where we are today, and the estimates are somewhere between $5 and $10 billion. So a quarter to a half of what they had in 2013. So they're even weaker, and they're engaging in activity around the region that America condemns. Why we would reach out and try to resuscitate this regime is beyond me. What I can only tell you is that many of the people who have joined this administration are veterans of the last administration. They felt like they had unfinished business, particularly after Donald Trump left the deal in 2018 and started applying pressure and sanctions on Iran. And so we have a situation now where it looks like the Biden administration is about to make the same mistakes as the Obama administration did. The one interesting wrinkle, or maybe two interesting wrinkles right now, is the diplomacy aspect with Israel and the Arab world speaking in one voice, and that may change some of the calculus. But the other part of it is that Israel is not sitting back this time. Last time around, Israel said, look, you're America, we trust you, we're gonna let you do what you're gonna do. We don't like it, but we're gonna let you do it. Right now, it does not look like Israel is going to sit on its hands at all. They look like they are going on the offensive, and they are going to either give America leverage or they're going to draw Iran into a conflict. And I don't know which will happen, but I am certain that the Israelis have made their plans. There was a remarkable speech by the IDF Chief of Staff, Yair Kochavi, I guess it was about 2 months ago now, at the Herzliya conference, a major defense conference in Israel that's held every spring. And he said very bluntly, in ways that I've never heard an Israeli military official speak before, he said, we have dusted off every plan that we devised to neutralize the Iranian nuclear threat and the Iranian military threat, and we will use them if America goes back into diplomacy. So there is a test of wills that is happening here right now, and it'll be very interesting to see who comes out on top. Of course, Israel is a much smaller country than the United States. It doesn't have the hard power or the soft power that the United States has, but Israel does have a lot of tools, that many of which we've never seen before. I mean, these cyber tools are amazing. They're able to destroy a nuclear facility without firing a shot. And that was the first round. Who knows what happens after that? So buckle up, folks. It's going to be a very, very interesting spring.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi, I see a question about the electoral stalemate.
Yes, I was hoping that you would address that.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry I didn't address it in my comments. The only thing that I can tell you is the reason why I've been a little bit shy about addressing this is that I don't know how it's going to end. Right now, it does appear that Naftali Bennett of the Israeli Yamina party could be the kingmaker in Israel. If he decides to join hands with Bibi, he will give Netanyahu a mandate. He will give him more than the 61 seats in the Knesset needed in order to form a coalition. The problem is that it's not going to be a stable coalition. Bennett and Bibi are like, I don't know, Tom and Jerry, oil and water, you name it. They don't get along very well. And it's one of the reasons why we've been in this stalemate. The right in Israel is extremely fractured. And by the way, the left is not exactly cohesive either. Labor and Meretz, these are two traditional parties that held a lot of sway during the Oslo process in the 1990s. They're smaller and they're fractured as well. Probably the most powerful center-left political figure in Israel right now is Yair Lapid from the Yesh Atid party, as it's known, the There Is Hope party. He's a very, very interesting guy. He's well-spoken. If anybody remembers Tommy Lapid, the former Israeli political figure, a Hungarian Holocaust survivor, this is Tommy Lapid's son. So he sort of comes from Israeli royalty, if you will, but he himself has not been able to cobble together a coalition of people to work with him to topple Netanyahu. What he has is at best a spoiler vote right now with some of the Arab parties and others. But I would say that right now it looks to be that we'll have another short-lived government along the lines of what we just had with Netanyahu and Gantz. It could go longer, but it's not likely. And then I think we'll probably head to a fifth election within the next, I would guess, the next year, maybe sooner if Bennett decides that he can't work with Netanyahu. But this does not bode well for Netanyahu, because really right now he needs more power. He's already weakened by his own lawsuits that are being filed against him for corruption. And he does not have the political power that he needs in order to carry out some of these military campaigns or cyber campaigns that he is looking to do. And so the real problem right now is the lack of a power center in Israel. And I would say that at some point it will be useful for Bibi to either decide to yield and to give way to someone else to step in, or to give concessions to a number of the other parties that he's having fights with, to allow them to come in under his coalition and to create something more stable. Right now, he's doing neither. And so while he's able to conduct these military campaigns effectively, there will come a question, I think, at a certain point about whether his mandate allows him to go much further beyond what he's already done. And that is my main concern, because as we all know, national security for Israel is the primary issue. Everything else is secondary. Economic, social issues. Israel looks at its security situation first and foremost. And if it has a prime minister that is not able to wield power the way that he should, it should be cause for concern.
Jonathan, I have a question. So I think that you kind of answered it, but I wanted to ask it for the sake of the congregants. What do you think is Bibi's success, despite of his lawsuits? Why was he reelected so many times?
Well, look, I will say this. Netanyahu is an extremely talented politician. He understands Israeli politics in ways that I don't think actually anybody understands in Israel. None of the other politicians have that same grasp. We joke that he plays three-dimensional chess and everyone else is playing checkers. This is the sort of Netanyahu brilliance. And actually Ron Dermer, who was his ambassador here in Washington for many years, is also brilliant and understands the politics of it incredibly well. I would also say that Bibi has done a really remarkable job. You think about it, you know, one of the successes that Donald Trump had was that he didn't get into a war over 4 years. It was the first time something like that has happened in recent memory. Netanyahu is seen as a warmonger of sorts, you know, that he's aggressive and he's right-wing. But what's amazing about Netanyahu is that he has stopped short of full-blown conflicts time after time. He's extremely careful. He has learned how to be surgical in his conflicts, whether it's Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah. He has been extremely careful and surgical. And so what he's been able to do is to preserve Israeli security while growing its economy and allowing it to prosper as a technologically advanced nation. This is success. This is what every Israeli wants to see. And so it's the reason why he continues to play the prominent role that he does in Israeli politics, even as frustration mounts, even as he deals with lawsuits, even as, you know, he's not able to keep a stable coalition. He is still King Bibi, as they call him. And you know, what's remarkable is that Netanyahu has been prime minister longer than any other politician in Israeli history. He has exceeded David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of the state of Israel. And so again, when we talk about how history is written, Bibi will go down as a flawed politician, no doubt, a flawed person perhaps, as we may learn from the lawsuits, although maybe we won't. He may walk away without having been proven guilty, but he will undoubtedly have left his mark on Israel's success and the way that it has prospered over the last decade. And actually, he came in 2009. Just think about that. He came in at the beginning of the Obama era. And so he's been here throughout all of this. And he really has steered Israel through a lot of stormy weather. So I give him full credit for that. I do think, he's going to have to make some tough decisions coming soon about his political career, but we cannot take away from him the fact that he has done remarkable things for the Jewish state.
And you are absolutely correct, because he did have opportunities, if he wanted to be a little bit more proactive and forceful with regards to a couple of countries surrounding Israel, and yet he tried to use the diplomacy instead. Another question, so maybe I'm thinking too much into it, but perhaps it was after reading the Rise and Kill Now. You're familiar with the book. So the same week when there was announcement about getting back into JCPOA, also announcement of unconditional help to Israeli defense, and the explosion in Iran. Is there a connection? And you kind of touched on it, but like the way I see it after reading the book is perhaps there was a coordination between American and Israeli government.
It's unclear about the coordination. We can say that during the Trump era, the Israelis had a green light to strike wherever they saw opportunities. And we saw them take out a nuclear scientist. We saw them take out an Al-Qaeda figure, a senior Al-Qaeda figure who had been based in Tehran, which, by the way, should set off some alarm bells for anybody who's paying attention in the region. The fact that Al-Qaeda has found a headquarters and a home in Iran should be a message for all of us. But we saw a green light there. Right now, I think the Israelis are still operating with a freedom that the administration now will not take away from them. They will not, the Biden administration will not say, Israel, you can't do this. But what we're hearing is more, statements like this could hurt diplomacy. It could set us back in the progress that we're making with Iran. And so this is the concern, that we're seeing some tension right now between Israel and the United States. But typically speaking, Israel has a very good relationship with the US intelligence community, with the CIA, the NSA, et cetera, and also a terrific relationship with the Pentagon. And of course, you probably saw this past week that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, paid a visit to Israel. It was the first cabinet level official to visit Israel during the Biden administration. He was unequivocal about his support for the state of Israel. He made it clear that the United States sees Israel as an incredibly valuable ally. The problem, of course, is that this all happened right at the same time as the explosion in Natanz and the attacks on the high seas. We're seeing a little bit of tension. And look, part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that the Biden administration is still figuring out how it wants to proceed. It may, at some point, call upon Israel to stop entirely, or, and this is my personal hope, that Biden will use Israel as the bad cop in these negotiations. He can be the good cop. He can say, look, we want to give you money. We want to let you, do whatever you want in the region. But we can't stop these guys. And they're going to keep bombing you unless you halt your terrorism and unless you stop your illicit and secret nuclear activity. And I think this would be we'll call it the John Grisham ending. The perfect ending to all of this would be for the United States to use Israel's position as leverage. This would be the perfect use of the US-Israel relationship, but we all have to get on the same page. We're not quite there yet. And by the way, getting back to Netanyahu, Biden and Netanyahu have maybe a little bit of a tense relationship dating back to the Obama years. And I'm not sure that Biden is quite ready to trust Bibi in this way. It could be after, the coalition is formed, that he will have no choice but to do so. And that would actually be a terrific way to move forward.
Does anyone else have questions? I think I had one more. And this is not something that you touched on, but many people wonder, and oftentimes we, as American Jews, get very frustrated with the way that Israel is presented in the media. And everyone, of course, asks, well, how come Israel doesn't strike back, doesn't show off all the incredible things that it does in the world, and how it supports countries that are in dismay, that the natural disasters, so on and so forth. The fact that sometimes the casualties occur, many times casualties occur because of the tactics that Hezbollah and Hamas uses. So where is Israelis present in the media that could raise also for young people that will have an easier time to fight anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism on campus. And I've heard that from several students. Recently, I participated in a dealer program, and one student especially was so concerned. He reached out, and he's afraid, when he will go to college, and he's like, how come Israel is not represented well in the media? Why is it always against?
Sure. It's a terrific question. I can give you a couple of thoughts. I wish I had all the answers, but look, the first thing is that I think Israel often sends the wrong people to do the job of what they call hasbara. Hasbara, by the way, is a terrible word. In Hebrew, hasbara comes from the word lahasbir, which means to explain. And in debate, if you're explaining, you're losing. But more to the point, when Israelis go on TV, they're not necessarily the Israelis that speak the best English. And so you hear people coming on TV and it's, let me tell you, and it doesn't speak well to the American audience. And so, Israel, I think, sometimes needs better spokespeople. By the way, I think Bibi, he speaks beautiful English. He comes from the great city of Philadelphia. I'm a son of Philadelphia. And by the way, Ron Dermer, also terrific. Michael Oren, the previous ambassador, was also obviously American born and terrific as a communicator, but not every Israeli has been a terrific communicator, in our mainstream media on Fox or on CNN or MSNBC, et cetera. And I think that's a problem. The other issue that I will just say is that the way that we teach our young people about Israel and how to defend Israel, because of course Israel's story is one that is just. There is no question about the fact that it has fought just wars and it has won them in miraculous fashion. The problem is that Israel is dealing with a problem of the Palestinians, and Israel is seen unbelievably, because it's a country that's the size of, I don't know, New Jersey, I suppose, or less, but it's seen as the Goliath, and the Palestinians are David. And this is a huge problem for Israel to overcome. One of the things that I've done, and this has been an important thing for me, is I have spent a lot of time studying the Palestinians. I actually started doing this when I went to Emory University. I had a professor who taught me to learn the other side of the story, because it was already clear that I knew the Israeli side of the story. And so I really began to learn the Palestinian side. And what you begin to learn actually is a couple of things. One is the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, is an organization that is deeply corrupt. It takes $600 million in American taxpayer funds every year, and it spends money on the families of convicted terrorists. They have a president who is 12 years beyond his 4-year term, okay? This guy's been in office for 16 years, and he won't leave. And people are wondering why the Palestinians don't have good governance, and they're pointing their fingers at Israel. And they only need to look as far as Mahmoud Abbas himself. And I don't think most people understand even who Mahmoud Abbas is. And that's a problem. The other issue, and I wrote an entire book about this, which by the way, everybody can find on Amazon.com. The book is called Hamas versus Fatah, and it documents the fact that in 2007, the two largest Palestinian factions, the PLO and Hamas, were engaged in a civil war against each other. And the result of that war was that Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. The PLO is clinging to control of the West Bank. And you now have Hamasistan and West Bankistan, two different governments, two different economies, two different security apparatus, two different, my friend Aaron David Miller says it's the Noah's Ark of the Palestinians, two of everything, right? But who talks about the fact that the Palestinians are at war with each other and have killed more people in their war than in Israel's last round of conflict with them? And so there is a real need to stop explaining Israel's position about how it's developing wonderful technology, or it's a leader in cyber, or it's helping the world conquer COVID. Those are all wonderful, but that's not what's going to change people's minds, because they still think about David and Goliath. And we need to explain that David is actually pretty corrupt, and it's infested with Hamas, and that the Palestinians are no saints, and that this is a territorial conflict between Israel, a democracy, and a couple of very brutal factions that have a history of terrorism and violence. This is the message. And I think that, unfortunately, not enough people have decided to go on the counteroffensive, if you will. And I think that it is necessary to tip the scales a little bit in a way that allows them to be balanced. Israel's not perfect. Israel makes lots of mistakes. Israel has all sorts of problematic policies. It can't even form a government after 2 years. But that doesn't mean that it's to blame for every ill in the Middle East. It is a good country. It's an ethical and moral country that is involved in a territorial conflict with a very, very thorny group of actors. And that is not made clear enough. And it's why I've spent so much time writing about this and talking about it in my think tank. And I thank you for asking that question, because as you can probably tell, I feel pretty strongly about it.
Right, and Palestinian people are caught between all of that, and it is certainly very unfortunate. But how, last one, any advice on how we can, forget the general media, but the social media, especially for young people, because maybe some of the young people will see the recording, because I am recording your presentation. Any advice to young people how to not even defend, I don't want to use the word defend, but to support and present Israel in a way that may change others' opinions. And I would share it with my daughters.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got young kids, and part of it is taking them to Israel, but also part of it is taking them to other parts of the Middle East and letting them see for themselves. My kids are right now, during the pandemic, we spent a lot of time learning about the other countries in the Middle East, and they are really excited to go to Dubai, where they've seen the pictures of the buildings with Israeli flags on them, and they want to learn about the Arab world. They want to go to Egypt. They want to see what's going on over there. And I think that is an incredibly important component of this, that if you only stay focused on Israel, well, then you end up just parroting a lot of things that are nice that you can say about Israel, but it doesn't equate to knowledge. Knowledge means understanding all of the factors that come into play here. And, I highly recommend, I always tell people, if you have kids that are going into college, have them take other languages, not just Hebrew. Hebrew is wonderful. And by the way, there's amazing apps where you can watch Israeli movies and TV now in Hebrew. It's terrific. But you have to start to broaden things out, because as we all know, the world is interconnected now. There's a huge amount of information out there. But interestingly, there are new allies that you can work with. I mean, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis are supporting Israel in its fight for survival against Iran. And to learn their situation and to support them is probably just as important as it is to support Israel. So my real advice is, encourage knowledge, encourage people to learn more, to go beyond Israel, to understand that there's a whole region out there, and Israel is it didn't used to be this way. Israel wasn't always a part of the Middle East. Today, it very much is, and it needs to be if it's going to survive. And so this has been a message that I've been trying to convey, that working to learn about that rest of the region is incredibly important for Israel's survival.
There are no other questions. You've got a compliment from my husband there. He says, well done, Jonathan.
I was wondering about the last name.
All right, if no more questions, I want to thank you. That was a really a great presentation, and you managed in what, half an hour, a little more, give an amazing overview of a very complex situation in a complex country. So,
Well, thank you very much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
okay, now I have to figure out how to unshare gallery. Okay, here we go. We're going to continue now with the service, and I want to share the screen because I think that it will be really appropriate to sing one of the famous Israeli songs, Al Hadvash, Al Kol Ele. על הדבש ועל העוקץ, על המר והמתוק, על ביתנו התינוקת שמורי לי הטוב, על האש המבוערת, על המים הזכים, על האיש השב הביתה מן המרחקים, על כל אלה, על כל אלה, שמור נא לי הטוב, על הדבש ועל העוקץ, על המר והמתוק, אל נטע קור נטוע, אל תשכח את התקווה, אשבנו ואשובה אל הארץ הטובה. אבינו שבשמיים, צור ישראל וגואלו, ברך את מדינת ישראל ראשית צמיחת גאולתנו, הגן עליה בעברת חסדך, ופרוס עליה סוכת שלומך, ושלח אורך ואמתך לראשיה, שריה ויועציה, ותקנם בעצה טובה מלפניך, ונתת שלום בארץ, ושמחת עולם ליושביה, ונאמר אמן. O Heavenly One, protector and redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shielded beneath the wings of your love, spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. And together, let us say, Amen. We now continue with Aleinu, on page 586. And if you may, please rise. עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגוררנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו You may be seated. The light of life is a finite flame, like the Shabbat candles. Life is kindled, it burns, it glows. It is radiant with warmth and beauty, but soon it fades, its substance is consumed, and it is no more. In light we see, in light we are seen. The flames dance and our lives are full, but as night follows day, the candle of our life burns down and gutters. There is an end of the flames. We see no more and are no more seen. Yet we do not despair. We are more than a memory, slowly fading in the darkness. With our lives, we give life. Something of us can never die. We move in the eternal cycle of darkness and death, of light and life.